All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Roller Coaster Words. Chapter 104, 6th Year, Bad Moon Rising.
Aggravated, spare the days. I troll downtown, the red light plays. Jump up, bubble up, what's in store? Love is the drug and I need to score.
Tuesday, the 4th of January, 1977. Sirius had come to a conclusion. It was an important conclusion, a revelatory conclusion, even. He had come to it 2 days after everyone had arrived back at the castle, when he found himself absent-mindedly studying the way Remus's tongue poked out of his mouth slightly as he took notes in charms, unaware that he was staring until he heard James whisper, "Sirius! Psst! Oi! Sirius!" He'd snapped his head around, startled, and found his friend peering over his shoulder, studying the left side of the classroom. "What are you looking at?" Sirius had swallowed audibly, whispering back quickly, "Nothing. No one." He had come to the conclusion soon after that. It was a simple conclusion, but quite necessary if he wanted to ensure that he did not completely obliterate every friendship he had left. The conclusion that Sirius had come to was this. It was all in his head. Christmas had been lovely, wonderful and thrilling and golden, but it had done something funny to him, and now every time Sirius looked at Remus he felt a strange ache inside his chest. They'd been sitting in the common room, and he'd find himself wanting to reach out and run a hand through those tousled curls, or lean over and kiss the side of his neck, or twine their fingers together and run a thumb over the small scars on the back of Minnie's hand. And that had been fine, when it was just the two of them. But it wasn't fine now, with their friends always watching, with the halls filled once more by black-robed students. The problem, Sirius thought, was that he was blowing everything out of proportion, letting his feelings get the better of him, making mountains out of molehills the way he always did. It wasn't like he'd absolutely needed to snog Remus in the middle of the common room, not like it was that hard to cast a silencing charm if they needed to, not like it was impossible to wait for James and Peter to fall asleep before he snuck into Minnie's bed. He'd just gotten spoiled over Christmas. The private intimacy had been so easy, so simple, so... well, it didn't matter. It had been a one-time thing, and it was over now. They could go right back to normal, back to broom cupboards and empty classrooms, and moans stifled under silencing charms. It was just a bit of fun, after all. Just getting off. Not like there was anything more to it. So, of course, it was all in Sirius's head, this strange, insistent longing he would sometimes feel when they kissed, or when he traced the scars on Minnie's ribs, or when he looked across the common room and saw Remus laughing with Mary, or Lily, or Marlene. And if it was all in his head, then that meant he could control it, stifle it, could wrangle it and squash it down and trample it to what it was supposed to be, which was, well, not this, not feeling like his heart had grown teeth. So when Emmeline Vance invited him to Hogsmeade, Sirius said yes. Why not? She was clever and pretty, and she'd been flirting with him for ages. Perhaps, he reasoned, he'd only begun to feel so strange around Remus because there hadn't been any girls about over Christmas, nothing to temper, or balance, or ground him, nobody to even things out. So he would go to Hogsmeade with Emmeline, and things would go back to normal again. Maybe he'd even make her his girlfriend. Maybe his problem with the girls had been keeping things casual. Maybe that's all there was to it. Of course, Sirius had no way to predict how Remus would respond to this decision. It took him completely by surprise one day when Mooney pulled back, just after Sirius had cast a locking charm on the cupboard door, and whispered, "Don't you think we ought to stop? Isn't it a bit confusing for you?" Sirius felt a spike of panic. Stop? After they'd just made it to the broom cupboard? Was this some sort of test? "Why would it be confusing?" he asked quickly. "It's not the same thing." "Oh." Remus's voice was quiet, soft, breath warm in the cramped space, and Sirius just wanted to... "Oh. Isn't it?" Why were they talking about this? Well, no. She's a girl. You're Mooney. What does that mean? It just means, you know, You and me, we're not, and she, oh, for goodness sake, he huffed, having no idea what he was supposed to say. I just can't see any reason to stop, okay? It's fun, isn't it? Remus sighed, like he'd been expecting something else. Yeah. Sirius wondered, nervously, if this was about the girls thing again. Look, he said reassuringly, if someone asked you out, that would be fine, obviously. Right, Remus said stiffly. That's nice of you. Oh, come on, don't be like that. Sirius pressed forward, kissing his cheek. They didn't talk much after that. Realistically, Sirius knew that the day would come when Remus would call things off. He'd get bored, or decide he was too weird, or get over this long-suffering martyr complex and go and snog a girl. If Sirius was a good friend, he might even encourage it, might try, again, to talk to Remus, to assure him that he wasn't a monster he'd made himself in his head, that if he wanted a girlfriend, there would be plenty of interested takers. But Sirius was selfish. He didn't want to stop what they were doing, even if Remus was only going along with it because he didn't think he deserved anything better. Even if it was still only ever Sirius pulling them into broom closets, sneaking into his bed, pawing at Mooney like an animal, like a begging dog. Even if it made him pathetic and disgusting and a bad friend, he didn't want to stop. Not ever. Besides, it really didn't matter. It was all just a bit of fun. Anything else was only in his head. Thursday, the 6th of January, 1977. When the wolf began to break, they were still in the forest. Padfoot watched him, writhing, whining, blood gone rancid with fear. It never got any easier. The sun had just begun to show her face when Remus opened his eyes, gasping, and cold winter light broke unevenly through the grasping branches of trees. Sirius took off his cloak and passed it over. Remus looked awfully pale against the dark, mulchy earth. Here, it's chilly. What happened? Why aren't we back in the shack? He sat up, wrapping the cloak around his shoulders, glancing sharply at James, who was cradling his arm and still panting with exertion. Did I hurt you, Prongs? Not on purpose, James assured him. You kept trying to get away from us, that's all. We couldn't get you to follow us like normal, not even Padfoot. I remember, Remus murmured, wincing as he stood. Were we hunting? You were, Sirius replied, studying his face. There was something you really wanted to get at. In Hogsmeade. In Hogsmeade? Remus frowned, eyes far away. Sirius watched him, remembering the desperate whining of the wolf, the way he'd howled, sniffing the air, eyes glowing like bright golden lanterns in the dark. You sure you're not hurt? Remus repeated, eyes on James's arm. James nodded earnestly, and Sirius thought of how the wolf had slammed into his side, too rough to be play-fighting, snarling low in his throat. Come on, James nodded towards Hogsmeade. We've got to get you back to the shack before Madame Pomfrey gets here. Remus picked his way carefully through the underbush on his bare feet, and Sirius walked beside him. We're not too far, he said quietly. We managed to sort of shepherd you in the right direction, but you kept trying to give us the slip. You all have to go back to the castle, Remus told them, staring down at his feet. I think something might have happened last night. Nothing happened, Mooney, Peter said. We didn't lose sight of you once, honestly. That's good, Remus nodded, as the shack appeared through the trees. But you still ought to go. Trust me. He was right. They heard news almost as soon as they got back, stumbling bleary-eyed down the common room, only to find everyone huddled over copies of the Daily Prophet, whose headline read, Full Moon Slaughter, Werewolves Strike Again. Following was a picture of a young wizard couple on their wedding day, starry-eyed and smiling like they could both burst with joy. He was in St. Mungo's, bitten. She was Muggle-born and dead. Sirius was surprised to see Remus at breakfast, but then, as he listened to their peers' hushed voices and caught sight of Snape's scowl across the room, he supposed he understood why. Remus's face was ashen as he sat, and Lily plopped down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He gave her a small smile. Sirius looked away. "It's horrible," Marlene sniffed, staring down at the newspaper that Mary had opened on top of her toast. "That poor woman! Murdered in her bed!" "Is it still on the loose?" Remus asked, voice strained. "Looks like," Mary muttered, scanning the page rapidly. "No one could catch it. Tonight's not a full moon, so we're all safe for at least another month, I suppose. That's the trouble with werewolves. If you don't catch them on the moon, then how are you supposed to catch them at all?" "There must be a test, or something," Marlene said, gripping Mary's shoulder as if to steady herself. "A revealing charm." "Yeah," Mary frowned. "Maybe, but then you might end up finding the wrong one." "Well, it sounds like they're all on you-know-whose side anyway, so I don't think it really matters. Let's talk about something else," Lily interrupted. "Yeah," James agreed quickly. "Defense Against the Dark Arts next. Anyone had any luck with their Patronus yet?" None of them had, except for James, of course, which quickly became apparent in their next lesson. He was the only student who was able to produce a fully formed Patronus, and the class watched in awe as a massive silver stag galloped circles around them. Sirius did a decent job himself, managing to cast a ghostly form that was distinctly canine when he concentrated on a memory of Euphemia Potter, smiling delightedly as she handed him a Bowie poster to hang in his room. Of the rest of their friends, the only one who had any success was Lily, whose wand emanated something cloudy and silvery, but with no clear shape. Peter had no luck at all, nor did Remus, who looked thoroughly exhausted by the end of class. Sirius hung back to talk to him as the rest of their group left, James gushing enthusiastically over Lily's half-formed Patronus, while she stared at him as if trying to figure out whether he was joking. "You'll get it, Moony," Remus smiled, reaching out to pat him on the back as they left. "You always do." Remus nodded half-heartedly, dark circles bruise-like under his eyes. "My mind's somewhere else, to be honest," he murmured softly. "Of course," Sirius lowered his own voice. "That's to be expected." "I knew about it," Remus whispered suddenly, as the last of their classmates trickled out. Sirius froze, staring at him. What was that supposed to mean? Sirius caught sight of the expression on his face and spoke hurriedly. "I mean, not exactly. I didn't know that it would happen, but—" Sirius shut the door and whispered a silencing spell, heart pounding as he turned around. "But what?" "Remember that night when we went to the Og's Head?" Remus was still whispering, words hushed and furtive. Sirius nodded, and he took a breath. "I smelled something." "I thought you were just pissed." "Yeah, I think maybe I did too. Or I thought it was, Remus flushed. "Well, you, because I wanted—" Sirius tried to ignore the sick, uncomfortable flips that his stomach was turning in as he watched Remus struggle for words. "You can't even say it," said that small, cold voice in the back of his head. "He thinks you're disgusting. Tainted. Anyway, it was definitely another one. A werewolf. I think it was a female." The nausea was overridden with a wave of relief. "Not Greyback, then?" "No." Sirius sighed, reaching out without thinking to grasp Moony's shoulder. "Well, thank Godric for that." But the relief was short-lived as he processed the rest of what Remus had said. Frowning, he asked, "But Moony, if you could smell them, do you think that they could—" "I don't know. I think so." Sirius felt a shiver of unease as he imagined another werewolf, snarling and hungry, prowling the forest in search of Moony. Okay, well, they didn't come after you, so everything will be fine." His hand was still on Remus's shoulder. Sirius realized he was staring, tangled in Moony's eyes, which were flickering with gold and so unbearably human. He wanted to— There was a sudden sharp knock at the door as the DAD professor returned, attempting to enter his own classroom. Sirius swallowed and moved away, giving Moony's shoulder one last squeeze. "Don't tell James," Remus whispered, a note of panic in his voice as they unlocked the door. "Please, don't tell anyone." Sirius stared at him for a moment. "Okay, Moony," he whispered back. "Anything you want." Chapter 105. 6th Year, Spilling Secrets. Friday the 14th of January, 1977. Remus was awake, again. Sirius listened to the quiet shifting sounds of his blankets as he moved, the frustrated sighs, the creaking bed frame. It had been 3 nights of this, of seeing the dim one-light from behind Minnie's curtains that meant he was reading, of waking in the night to the sounds of his tossing and turning, or walking down to breakfast the next morning and watching as the dark circles under his eyes got darker, day by day. It took no stretch of the imagination to figure out what was keeping him up. Ever since the werewolf attack had been announced in the newspapers, Remus had gone quiet, sullen, robotic in classes and strained in their conversations with friends. Sirius hated it, hated how familiar it was. Like the transformations on the full moon, he could do nothing but watch Remus rip himself apart from the inside out, helpless to stop it. The bedsheet shifted again. The wood frame creaked. There was a sigh, more shifting, a muffled groan. Sirius had had enough. James thought Remus needed space, but they had been giving him space, and it didn't seem to have done him any good. It was time to try a different tack. "Oi, Mooney," he whispered, creeping over to Remus's bed. He parted the curtains carefully, squinting in the dark. "What's wrong?" "Sorry, did I wake you up?" Remus squinted back as Sirius cast a quick lumos, settling onto the end of the bed and letting the curtains fall shut behind him. He cast a silencing charm, as well, more reflex than anything at this point. "Yeah, but it's okay." He crawled further up the bed so that he could sit next to Mooney. "Oh," the other boy ducked his head. "Look, I'm really not in the mood for—" "Oh, no, me neither." Sirius flushed. Merlin, how desperate must he seem? "I mean, well, actually, now you come to mention it." There was something to be said about the way Remus's thin pyjama shirt hung off his shoulders, silhouetted in the dim light. "But no, not why I came over." "Right. So, what's up?" "Can't sleep." "I can tell. Want a fag?" "Run out." "It's okay. I got some off Emmeline. Come on, shall we go downstairs? It's late, no one will be there, and Prongs will give a shit if we smoke up here." "Okay," Remus said slowly, sliding out from under the bed covers. Sirius tried not to look too thrilled that he'd actually managed to coax Mooney out of his solitary pity party. Maybe Emmeline was good for something. That was rude. He liked Emmeline. She was very pretty, and he enjoyed spending time with her. There were lots of good things to be said for her, not least of which was her generosity with cigarettes. Still, it was satisfying to be the one providing Mooney with fags, for once. Down in the common room, Remus drifted towards the window, and they sat down together on the love seat there. Mooney curled up, drawing his knees into his chest, and Sirius mirrored his position so that they were facing each other. "So," he stuck a cigarette between his teeth, and sucked, lighting it wordlessly before passing it over to Remus. He continued to speak as he lit another for himself. "What's the plan?" "Plan?" Mooney's brow furrowed. "You've been up for the past 3 nights, and you haven't got a plan. Are you sure you're Mooney?" That seemed to snap him out of it. Remus said decisively, "I want to go back to the hogshead." A cold shiver of unease ran its finger down Sirius's spine. He took a moment before speaking, looking out at the window, letting smoke settle in his lungs before he breathed it back out. "Right. Okay, I think I can understand why." Sirius knew how dreadful it could be, the not knowing, the wondering. "Invisible?" "No." Remus had one arm folded over his knees, fingers tapping anxiously on his shin. "No, if he's there, if she's there, then I want to meet her." "Remus? No." Was he out of his mind? "Why not?" Remus frowned, voice sharp and heated. That anger seemed to surge sometimes from nowhere, hidden so often behind a thick wall of impenetrable stoicism. "Because it's dangerous? Because you've never met them before, and you don't know what they're actually like, except that they murdered a woman the other night? Because you're not even 17 yet, and if you have to defend yourself with magic, then you could get kicked out of school?" Sirius stared in disbelief as he spoke, shocked by the utter disregard that Remus seemed to pay to his own safety. "You'll get hurt," he thought helplessly. "They could hurt you." Remus scowled at him. stubbing out his half-finished cigarette and standing so that he towered over Sirius, forcing the other boy to crane his neck and look up. "You can't tell me what to do. Just don't get in my way." "Don't be like that. Look, I understand how you feel." Sirius huffed impatiently. "Okay, I don't understand, but I want you to be safe." "I will be. It's ages till the next full moon. She won't have any advantage over me. Don't you think this is exactly what Greyback wants?" Remus's eyes flashed dangerously. "What are you saying?" he snarled. "That I'm being stupid?" "No, not stupid, just reckless." Sirius Black lecturing me on recklessness. Very bloody funny, that. "Oi!" Sirius felt his own anger rising, a boiling tide. Remus seemed to sense it, features sharpening, a wolf going in for the kill. "Well, it's pretty rich of you to tell me not to put myself in danger," he growled. "You weren't so concerned about my safety this time last year." It hurt. It hurt because it was true, and they both knew it, and beneath the fragile barrier of forgiveness, Sirius could tell that they both still hated him for it. That's not fair, Minnie," he mumbled, deflating. This was a fight he knew he couldn't win. Remus stared at him, and Sirius could feel his anger in the air, a palpable weight, thick and dense as fog. He could feel it when Remus tried to bite it back, to reel it in, jaw clenching as he stifled whatever else he wanted to say. "I have to meet them," Remus said, finally. "I think I'll go mad otherwise." He released a breath. "I think I'm already going mad." Sirius swallowed a lump in his throat. "Okay." He ran fingers through his hair. "Okay, what about Ferox? Have you tried talking to him?" "Thought about it. He'll try and stop me. Moody too. It's their idea not to let me go to Hogsmeade in the first place." All right, then we'll go together, okay? Together. We'll tell James, and—" "I don't want anyone else to know," Remus hissed. "It's private." "Merlin, Mooney, you're not making this easy." "Oh, it's not easy. It's fucking difficult, okay? But I have to do it." "Okay." Sirius raised his hands, surrendering. They could make it work. They would find a way to make it work. As long as he was there, as long as Mooney didn't go alone, he would keep him safe. Remus sat suddenly, heavily, on the nearest sofa, pitching forward and burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know I'm being... It's just all so..." "I do understand, Mooney." Sirius sat next to him, heart crawling into his throat. "I'm trying to help." "You can't help." Remus's voice hitched as he spoke. "I have to do it on my own. I can't risk anyone else. It has to be me. I have to..." The words spilled like shattered glass from his lips, sharp and jagged, all edges. "If I can meet her, then maybe... I have to meet Greyback one day. I just know I have to. And I want to. Not to join him or anything like that. Just to know him. To understand why he did what he did and why he made me who I am." He was crying, tears glittering like stars in his eyes. Sirius stared as Remus buried his face once more in his hands, trying to get control of his own strangled heartbeat. He recognized it, that desire, that desperate need to understand, to ask, "Why did you do this to me? Why do you always do this to me?" "Mooney," Sirius stretched out a hand tentatively, placing it gently on his friend's shaking shoulder. "He didn't make you who you are." "You made me what I am." Sirius had never seen him cry like this. Great, shuddering sobs that shook his entire body. He wasn't sure if he'd ever seen Mooney cry at all before. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know what he was allowed. Did he wrap his arms around him? Did he pull him into his chest? Did he cling to his shoulders? Did he try to absorb the weight of this grief with his own body? "I'd take it from you," he thought pathetically, "if I could." But Sirius knew better than anyone that he couldn't. There was no uprooting that kind of hurt, the kind that had been planted so young, grown twisted like a vine around the soul. He thought of his own family, their cold eyes, the same eyes that stared out at him every morning in the mirror. Who was he to tell Remus what wasn't true, to make claims about making or unmaking? "You're more than that," he wanted to say, but it's what James always said to him, and Sirius knew, really, that didn't make things better. You could grow and change and prune away the rotten bits of yourself, but there would always be some parts that stuck, some things you couldn't undo. So he didn't speak, and he didn't try to take it away. Whatever Remus was feeling was his to feel, and Sirius knew that there were parts he would never understand. But he stayed. He sat beside him on the worn common room couch and slid his hand into Mooney's and squeezed his fingers. "I'm here," he thought desperately. "I'm not going anywhere." Saturday, the 15th of January, 1977. Sirius woke the next morning with a horrible ache in his neck and something nudging the side of his leg. He shifted, coughing at the taste of ash on the back of his tongue, opening his eyes and remembering abruptly they were still in the common room. He'd fallen asleep, sitting up, head leaned back at a 45-degree angle against the sofa, which explained the awful crick in his neck. He winced, straightening, and turned to look at Remus. "Morning." The other boy had fallen asleep, curled up on the other end of the sofa. He still had the blanket that Sirius had thrown over him and pulled up to his chest. He yawned, stretching, long limbs unfurling. "What time is it?" Sirius asked, looking away. "Nearly 7. James will be up for Quidditch in a minute." "Yeah. You okay?" Remus turned away from him, sitting up and rubbing at his legs. "I slept, at least," he said quietly. "Sorry for last night." "Pfft," Sirius waved a hand dismissively. "It was nothing. I've had much worse meltdowns." "What are you two tosses doing down here at this hour?" James boomed, broom in hand and bouncing down the stairs. He paused for a moment, eyeing their pyjamas and now crumpled blanket. "Did you sleep here?" "Had to," Sirius smirked. "Anything to get away from your snoring." James laughed, seeming to accept this. "Weirdos. Don't fancy joining me for a quick go around the pitch before practice, Padfoot?" "Nah," Sirius yawned hugely. "I'm going back to bed. It's Saturday, Potter, you lunatic." One thing he did not miss from being on the Quidditch team, Potter's deranged workout schedule. "It's Hogsmeade later. Don't oversleep," James reminded him, glancing apologetically at Remus. "Sorry, Minnie." "It's okay," Remus smiled. "You lot go and have fun. I've got homework, obviously. The common room will be nice and quiet." "See you both for breakfast, then," James called over his shoulder, not bothering to wait for a response as he hurried off to his second favourite place at Hogwarts, the Quidditch pitch. His favourite, of course, was wherever Lily Evans happened to be. The quiet peace of the empty common room had been effectively shattered. James was only the first of a steady stream of students that would soon be filing down, heading for breakfast or the Quidditch pitch, or looking to get a head start on their homework before Hogsmeade. Remus turned, catching Sirius's eye. "Are you really going back to bed?" He cocked a brow. "Yeah. Want to come?" It was entirely normal, he assured himself, the flood of warmth that spread through him when Remus laughed. "Where's Emmeline?" James asked as he stood from the bench where he'd been waiting. "Oh," Sirius shrugged. She didn't fancy it." James frowned. "I thought the whole reason we were going to see the shack was because she was too scared to go alone." Not exactly." Sirius rubbed the back of his head, sheepish. "I actually just sort of needed to talk to you. Privately." He had left Emmeline in the Three Broomsticks with a group of her giggling Ravenclaw friends, and she didn't seem too upset. He'd met her early to walk down together, after all, and had bought her a box of candied roses at Honeyduke's, which Mary had explained was romantic, and they'd spent quite a bit of time in the alleyway behind Scriven shafts, getting to know each other a bit better. All in all, Sirius thought he'd gone above and beyond to fulfill his boyfriendly duties, and was entitled to a bit of time without a bunch of girls breathing down his neck. James studied his face for a moment, brow furrowed. "All right," he said slowly. "What's up?" They began to walk, side by side, towards the shack. The road was mostly empty. It was bitterly cold out, and the majority of Hogwarts students had elected to remain in the cosy heat of the Three Broomsticks, or Madame Pudford's. Once they were well out of earshot of any lingering promeneurs, Sirius began to speak. "I'm worried about Remus," he said bluntly. "Remus?" "Mm-hmm." "Figured as much," James sighed, hands shoved deep in his pockets of his cloak. "Did something happen? Last night?" "Sort of." Sirius hesitated, wondering how much he could say. "It's just all this werewolf stuff. I think it's getting to him." James nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose that's to be expected. Can't pretend I haven't noticed anything myself." "Exactly. He's acting like every attack is his fault or something. Like he's personally responsible just because, well, you know. Are you saying that Remus is acting like it's his responsibility to prevent the attacks because he happens to share one thing in common with the people who committed them, and so he beats himself up and starts lashing out at all his mates whenever he reads about them in the paper?" When Sirius looked over, James had a single eyebrow raised and a wry smile on his face. That's not the same, and you know it," he muttered, kicking at a patch of ice with his shoe. "If you say so." "I do say so. Look, it's really not the same. I'm worried that Remus is going to do something reckless that will get him in trouble." Sirius glared, and James shook his head, chuckling. "Merlin, what am I going to do with you two?" He sighed and grew serious again. "Look, Black, I get it. I mean, trust me, I get it. But you can't preemptively stop him from doing something stupid. Believe me, I learnt that lesson the hard way." Sirius swallowed, looking back down at the ground. After a moment, he said quietly, "We have to do something, James. It's different this time. I can't explain how, it just is." James frowned at him, searching his face. "It's really bothering you, isn't it?" he asked kindly, and for a moment Sirius almost found himself telling James everything. "Yes." The other boy sighed, running a hand through his hair. They had reached the shack now, and stood staring at its dingy, soulless windows. "Look, Sirius, I really wish I could tell you what to do, but I'm just as lost as you are. Sometimes the only thing we really can do is be there, you know? Just listen to him if he talks to you. And if he doesn't, then you talk to him. Don't let him shut himself up and sulk." Sirius frowned. "Thought you said we should give him space," he muttered petulantly. James rolled his eyes. "Yeah, only because I know how much of an annoying prick you can be when you're trying to force someone to get over themselves. But if you've given him space and it isn't working, well, just be there for him, all right? That's all we can really do." Sirius sighed, knowing that James was right, but it did nothing to calm the ugly tangle of nerves squirming in the pit of his stomach, as they turned and walked back down towards the village, bracing themselves against the frigid cold. He couldn't shake the feeling that something awful was going to happen. Chapter 106. 6th Year, The Long Night. Sirius was still on edge throughout dinner, sneaking glances at Mooney from across the table as James tried to get Lily's attention by balancing a spoon on his nose. Remus was chatting quietly with Marlene about their Care of Magical Creatures homework, looking completely at ease, a far cry from the frantic desperation of the previous night. Sirius studied him, searching for any sign of cracks. He only glanced away when Minnie looked up and shot him a bemused smile. Things seemed normal as they trudged up the stairs to Gryffindor Tower. Normal as they got ready for bed. Normal as Remus bid them good night and shut his curtains. Sirius wondered if James had been right, if he simply being there was enough. Perhaps he really had blown things out of proportion, worrying himself silly over nothing. After all, Mooney had at least agreed not to run off alone, hadn't he? So he lay in bed, listening for the familiar sounds of Remus tossing and turning. But there was nothing, only silence, and eventually Sirius drifted off to sleep. He slept poorly, dreams fragmented with nightmarish nonsense, feelings and images pulled from the depths of his subconscious mind, overlaid by the unrelenting feeling that he was being followed. Sirius was running, glancing frantically back over his shoulder, when a loud bang suddenly yanked him back to consciousness. "Remus Lupin!" Professor McGonagall's shrill voice shocked him from sleep. Sirius sat bolt upright, ripping his curtains back. McGonagall, clad in her nightgown and dressing robe, was marching straight for Mooney's bed, lit one brandished like a torch. "Professor, James's stunned voice came from across the room. Both he and Peter had poked their heads out from behind their curtains as well. The three boys watched in thunderstruck silence as their teacher stormed across the stone floor. She ripped the curtains from Remus's bed back, and Sirius felt his heart turn to stone in his chest. Remus was gone. His bed lay empty, pillows rumpled, sheets snarled from where he'd kicked them off. No, Sirius thought, frozen. He wouldn't. McGonagall stared down, lips pressed together in a thin line. She looked furious and terrified. After a moment she spun on her heel and began to march back out of the room. "What? Professor!" James scrambled out of bed, calling after her. "Professor! Wait! What's going on? Where's Remus?" Sirius continued to stare blankly at the abandoned mattress. "He wouldn't do that. He said we'd go together. He's supposed to let me help him." McGonagall paused in the doorway, harried and tense. "I'm sorry, Mr. Potter, but I'm afraid there isn't time to explain." "Did something happen? Is Remus okay?" Now Peter was crawling out of bed as well, staring anxiously up at the Transfiguration teacher as he asked this question. He wouldn't do that. I'm sorry, boys, but there simply isn't. He's gone to Hogsmeade, hasn't he?" Sirius's voice sounded strange to his own ears. Flat, monotone, dull. He was still staring at Remus's bed. McGonagall's eyes flashed as she turned to him. "How did you know that, Mr. Black?" she asked sharply. Sirius swallowed, tearing his eyes away from the twisted sheets. "He talked to me about it. He said he needed to see them. It." The stern professor narrowed her eyes. "Are you telling me that you knew your friend had plans to go and confront a violent wanted criminal on his own, and you neglected to inform anyone?" "No. I mean, yes, but I didn't think—" Oh, Merlin! There were tears in his eyes. He was going to cry. He could feel it. Sirius sucked in a breath, trying desperately to swallow the lump in his throat. "I didn't know he was going to go alone. I swear, Professor, I had no idea he'd—" His voice broke, and he stopped speaking to scrub roughly at his face. McGonagall continued to watch him, features lit severely from the cold glow of her wand light. After a moment she tutted impatiently, muttering, "There isn't time for this." She swept out of the door, snapping at James when he began to speak. "No, Potter! For the last time, you'll wait with Mr. Black. I need to find Albus immediately." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving an awful, frigid silence in its wake. James and Peter continued to stare, incredulously, at where McGonagall had just stood seconds before, but eventually they turned to Sirius. He was still in bed, rubbing salty tears off his cheeks. The other boys approached. Sirius threw back his sheets, standing. "Black," James said slowly, in a voice one might use for a cornered animal. "Sirius, what's going on?" He was pacing, trudging fingers through his hair, wiping his nose roughly with the back of his hand. Bloody fucking liar. Bloody Remus and his bloody stupid fucking martyr complex. Never fucking listening. "Black!" James's voice snapped him out of the whirlpool spiral of his thoughts, and Sirius looked up sharply. Their eyes met. James's face softened. "What's going on?" Sirius shook his head, hands clenching into fists. "He's gone to Hogsmeade." "Why?" "The werewolf." Cold understanding broke over James's features. Peter glanced back and forth between them anxiously. "What?" "The werewolf," Sirius repeated, frustrated. "To talk to her, or, I don't know, confront her." "Her? You said it was a girl." "What?" Sirius paused, looking up at his friends' confused faces, realizing what he'd let slip. He hesitated, caught in their anxious, searching gazes. And he'd promised Remus. He knew he had, but fuck Remus. Fuck him for leaving, again, for disappearing, for always pulling away. "We went to Hogsmeade," Sirius said, words spilling out of him, "on Christmas Eve, and Remus, he didn't realize what it was, but he smelled—" "The other wolf," James whispered, watching him. "The one that attacked that couple." Sirius nodded frantically. Peter frowned, baffled. "But why would he want to go to it? Doesn't he know it's dangerous?" "Yes," Sirius growled, wishing he could just punch something, or "Black," James was looking at him, brow furrowed in concern. Sirius swallowed, saying helplessly, "He wasn't supposed to go alone." After a moment, James nodded. Peter continued to look back and forth between them, trying desperately to keep up. "What? You weren't going to go with him, were you?" "Come on," James said quietly. "Let's go downstairs, all right? We can wait in the common room." Sirius didn't want to wait. He wanted to do something. To sprint down the tower stairs, to turn into Padfoot and run as fast as he could to Hogsmeade, to find Remus and punch him and scream at him and kiss him until he couldn't breathe. Fine. They walked together down the stairs, with James in the lead. The common room was empty, silent and dark. James moved over to the fireplace and mumbled a quick incendio, lighting the fire in the grate. Peter settled down on the sofa, leg bouncing nervously, and Sirius threw himself into the adjacent armchair, glaring at the snapping flames. "Remus bloody Lupin," he thought furiously. "I could kill you." They waited. There was nothing else to do. They sat and stood and shifted. They paced and yawned and stared at the clock on the mantel. Sirius tried not to think too much about what might be happening. Tried not to imagine Mooney torn away from Hogwarts by a pack of hungry wolves. Mooney, alone, facing down a crazed murderer. Mooney, ripped open and left out to bleed. Like that woman in the newspaper. Sirius thought of the scar just above Remus's hip. Dimpled skin, each tooth its own snarl. The worst already happened. His fingers twitched, where he was tapping them on his knee. It was just past 3 a.m. when the portrait hole finally swung open. Sirius sat up as if electrified the moment Remus appeared, dragging his feet through the door. "He's fine," Sirius thought dizzily. "He's all right. He's okay." Bandaged arm, haggard face, like something wrung out and left to dry. But that was nothing. That was 100 times better than bloodied or broken or gone for good. The relief nearly crushed him, nearly knocked him off his feet. It lasted for a moment. Then the anger returned. "What do you think you're playing at?" He forgot to be quiet. Didn't care if he woke up the whole bloody tower. "Running off on your own?" "Please, Padfoot, I'm knackered." Remus brushed him off, sighing deeply and rubbing a hand across his forehead. Sirius wanted to strangle him. "Do you have any idea what it's like finding out that you'd sneaked off?" Remus raised an eyebrow pointedly, and Sirius suddenly realized that he was the only one shouting, the only one who'd run forward, the only one who seemed to be angry at all. James and Peter were still hovering by the fireplace. Relief and confusion mixed across their faces as they stared at the scene unfolding in front of them. Sirius's stomach twisted. "For all of us, I mean," he said quickly, lowering his voice. "I can imagine," Remus frowned. "I'm sorry, but please can I just go to bed? You can have a go at me in the morning." "Yeah, back off, Black," James murmured, moving forward to rest a hand on Sirius's shoulder. Sirius shrugged him off, biting his tongue to keep from shouting again. Why were they all so calm? Remus could have... James took his glasses off to rub at his eyes. "It's late, and we're all tired. You sure you're all right, Minnie?" "Fine," Remus insisted, shooting James a grateful look. And that was that. They filed back up to their room, climbing into their beds and shutting their curtains without another word. Sirius knew he should have been tired. Physically, he was utterly exhausted, muscles turning to lead the moment he lay down. But he couldn't seem to shut off his mind. As he listened to the marauder's deep breathing and James's familiar snoring, the anger in his chest coiled more tightly. "Fuck you, Remus," he thought viciously. "Fuck you for acting like everything's all right. Fuck you for leaving me without saying anything. Fuck you," he fumed miserably in the darkness, "for making me feel this way."